What happens when those sworn to protect and serve become the very thing we need protection from? When the badge becomes a shield for unspeakable acts, and the uniform transforms from a symbol of safety into a harbinger of terror? These aren't fictional tales spun from imagination. These are the documented horrors that lurk behind squad car doors and precinct walls, stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about justice and corruption. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night in October 1987. Detective Sarah Martinez had been on the force for 8 years, long enough to think she'd seen everything the darkest corners of human nature had to offer. She was wrong. Dead wrong. The address led her to a modest ranch house in suburban Milwaukee, where the porch light flickered intermittently like a dying heartbeat. Officer Tommy Kowalski, a rookie with barely 6 months under his belt, had responded first to what dispatch had logged as a wellness check. An elderly neighbor had called in concerns about strange sounds coming from the residence, sounds that, according to her trembling voice on the 911 recording, didn't sound human. Martinez found Kowalski standing motionless in the driveway, his face pale as moonlight, radio clutched in his shaking hand. She'd never seen him like this. Tommy was usually the cocky type, full of bravado and bad jokes. Now he looked like he'd aged a decade in the span of an hour. "What have we got?" Martinez asked, but Kowalski just pointed toward the house with a finger that wouldn't stop trembling. I can't go back in there," he whispered. "Detective, I think we need to call the FBI." The front door hung open, creaking on its hinges with each gust of autumn wind. Martinez drew her service weapon and approached slowly, her training kicking in despite the ice-cold dread that had begun to settle in her stomach. The smell hit her first, a nauseating mixture of copper and decay that made her eyes water. But it was what she found inside that would haunt her for the rest of her career. The living room looked normal at first glance. Family photos lined the mantelpiece showing a middle-aged man in various police uniforms, spanning what appeared to be a 20-year career. Detective James Hartwell, according to the nameplate on the coffee table. Martinez recognized him, a well-respected veteran who'd recently retired after decades of exemplary service. But the photos told only part of the story. Behind the couch, Martinez discovered what Kowalski had fled from. A hidden door, cleverly disguised as part of the wood paneling, stood ajar. The stench emanating from beyond it was overwhelming. With her weapon raised and her heart hammering against her ribs, she descended the wooden steps into what should have been a basement. Instead, she found hell. The basement had been converted into something that defied description. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, each containing glass jars filled with what appeared to be human organs floating in preservative fluid. Photographs covered every available surface, hundreds of them, documenting unspeakable acts committed against victims who looked disturbingly young. But most horrifying of all were the detailed logs, meticulously handwritten in neat police script, documenting 20 years of systematic torture and murder. Each entry was dated and signed, Deti. J. Hartwell, badge number 4471. The logs revealed a pattern that made Martinez's blood run cold. Hartwell had used his position as a detective to target vulnerable victims, runaways, addicts, sex workers, people whose disappearances wouldn't be thoroughly investigated. He'd offer them help, promise them protection, then bring them here to his suburban house of horrors. The entries described in clinical detail how he'd kept some victims alive for weeks, experimenting on them with a doctor's precision and a sadist's imagination. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the references to partners scattered throughout the logs. Names, badge numbers, and detailed accounts of other officers who'd not only known about Hartwell's activities, but had actively participated. The corruption ran deep, creating a network of predators hiding behind badges and feeding off the very people they'd sworn to protect. Martinez was still processing the magnitude of what she'd discovered when she heard footsteps on the stairs behind her. She spun around, weapon raised, expecting to see Kowalski. Instead, she found herself facing 3 figures in police uniforms, their faces hidden in shadow. Detective Martinez, the lead figure, spoke in a voice she recognized but couldn't immediately place. "You've seen too much. The investigation that followed would rock the Milwaukee Police Department to its core, but not in the way anyone expected. Within hours of Martinez's discovery, evidence began disappearing. The basement was accidentally contaminated by a burst water pipe. Crucial files were misfiled in the wrong department. Witnesses suddenly developed selective amnesia or disappeared entirely. Martinez found herself reassigned to traffic duty, her credibility questioned by supervisors who suggested she'd suffered a stress-related breakdown. The official report listed the incident as a case of an elderly retiree's suicide, with no mention of the basement chamber or the evidence of decades-long serial murder. James Hartwell was posthumously honored at a memorial service attended by hundreds of his fellow officers, including many whose names Martinez recognized from his logs. But Martinez wasn't the type to give up easily. Working nights and weekends, she began her own investigation into the network of corruption that had protected Hartwell for so long. What she uncovered was a conspiracy that reached far beyond one detective's basement of horrors. The trail led her to similar cases across the country, patterns of disappearances, evidence tampering, and suspicious suicides that all pointed to a nationwide network of corrupt officers. In Chicago, a detective named Robert Chen had been found dead in his apartment just days before he was scheduled to testify about irregularities in missing persons cases. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drug overdose, despite the fact that Chen had been clean for over 5 years and was known to be terrified of needles. In Phoenix, Officer Maria Santos had attempted to blow the whistle on senior officers who she claimed were involved in human trafficking. Santos was found dead in her patrol car, apparently having shot herself with her service weapon. The suicide note, written in handwriting that graphologists would later determine was not hers, apologized for making false accusations against her colleagues. The deeper Martinez dug, the more connections she found. Credit card records showed unusual travel patterns among certain officers, with frequent trips to isolated locations across multiple states. Property records revealed a network of remote cabins and warehouses owned by shell companies linked to police pension funds, and phone records showed a web of communication between officers in different jurisdictions who had no official reason to be in contact. Martinez's investigation was interrupted when she arrived home one evening to find her apartment had been burglarized. Nothing of obvious value had been taken, but all of her files related to the Hartwell case had vanished. A note left on her kitchen table, written in the same neat handwriting she'd seen in Hartwell's logs, contained just 4 words: drop it or join them. The message was clear, but Martinez had come too far to turn back now. She'd seen too much, learned too much, and lost too much sleep thinking about the victims whose disappearances had been covered up by the very people who should have been seeking justice for them. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Michael Chen, the brother of the deceased Chicago detective, contacted Martinez after seeing her name in connection with similar cases. Dr. Chen was a forensic pathologist who'd been quietly conducting his own investigation into his brother's death. What he'd discovered would finally provide the missing pieces of the puzzle. My brother wasn't investigating missing persons cases, Dr. Chen explained during their clandestine meeting in a 24-hour diner outside Milwaukee. He was investigating organ trafficking, specifically organs being harvested from victims who were supposed to be listed as missing or dead. The medical examiner's records that Dr. Chen had accessed showed a disturbing pattern. Bodies found in various jurisdictions across the Midwest all showed signs of surgical removal of organs, performed with professional skill but under non-sterile conditions. The victims were typically transients or others on society's margins, people whose bodies might not be closely examined if they turned up dead. But the organs weren't being sold on the black market as Martinez had initially assumed. Instead, Dr. Chen's research suggested they were being used for something far more sinister: a network of wealthy individuals who believed that consuming human organs would grant them longevity and power. The police officers weren't just covering up murders. They were facilitating a cannibalistic cult that had infiltrated law enforcement agencies across multiple states. The evidence was overwhelming, but also dangerous. Dr. Chen had already survived one attempt on his life, and Martinez was beginning to notice unmarked cars following her wherever she went. They both knew they were running out of time before the network moved to permanently silence them. Their plan was simple, but desperate. They would simultaneously release all their evidence to media outlets, federal authorities, and civil rights organizations, hoping that the sheer volume of disclosure would prevent a complete cover-up. But they needed one more piece of evidence, something that would directly link the organ harvesting to active police officers. That evidence came in the form of a recording made by Detective Robert Chen before his death. Hidden in a safety deposit box that Dr. Chen had finally gained access to, the recording contained his brother's detailed account of infiltrating a gathering of the cult. The description was so horrifying that Martinez had to pause the playback several times to compose herself. The gathering, according to Detective Chen's recording, had taken place in a remote warehouse outside Chicago. Police officers from multiple jurisdictions were in attendance, still wearing their uniforms as they participated in ritualistic consumption of human organs. The leader of the group, identified as Police Captain William Morrison, had described their activities as achieving ultimate power over life and death. Detective Chen's recording also revealed that the group had been operating for over 3 decades, with membership passing from generation to generation within certain police families. New members were initiated through participation in increasingly horrific acts, ensuring their complete loyalty and silence. Those who tried to leave or expose the group were eliminated, their deaths made to look like suicides or accidents. But perhaps most chilling of all was Detective Chen's discovery that the group had been specifically targeting police officers and their families, who showed signs of developing a conscience about their activities. Martinez realized with growing horror that her own investigation had likely been anticipated, and that she was now a primary target for elimination. The recording ended with Detective Chen's voice breaking as he described his plan to gather physical evidence from the next gathering. "If something happens to me," he whispered into the microphone, "at least people will know the truth. These monsters in uniforms have been feeding off our community for decades, and someone has to stop them." Martinez and Dr. Chen agreed to release the evidence the following Tuesday, giving them time to make copies and distribute them to multiple sources. But as Martinez drove home that night, she noticed the unmarked car following her was no longer bothering to stay hidden. It pulled alongside her at a red light, and through the tinted windows, she could see the silhouette of someone in a police uniform. Her cell phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, with the tone of someone accustomed to giving orders. "Detective Martinez, this is Captain Morrison. I believe you have something that belongs to us." Martinez's blood went cold. Morrison was the name from Detective Chen's recording, the leader of the cannibalistic cult. He was calling her directly, which meant they knew exactly how much she'd discovered. "We'd like to arrange a meeting," Morrison continued. "Somewhere we can discuss this situation like professionals. I think you'll find our offer quite reasonable." "I don't negotiate with murderers," Martinez replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Morrison's laugh was like ice cracking. "Oh, Detective, I think you misunderstand the situation. We're not negotiating. We're simply giving you the courtesy of a choice. You can disappear quietly, like so many others, or we can make this very public and very painful for everyone you care about." The line went dead, but the message was clear. Martinez had until Tuesday to decide between her own life and the lives of countless future victims. She spent the weekend making arrangements she prayed she'd never need. Copies of all evidence were distributed to safety deposit boxes in 3 different states. Detailed instructions were left with Dr. Chen about media contacts and federal authorities who might still be trustworthy. And most importantly, she recorded her own detailed account of everything she'd discovered, to be released in the event of her death or disappearance. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cuts through even the heaviest coat. Martinez had arranged to meet Dr. Chen at the FBI field office downtown, where they planned to make their formal presentation to federal authorities. She was running late due to an accident that had blocked her usual route, an accident that looked suspiciously staged to delay her arrival. When she finally reached the federal building, Martinez found Dr. Chen's car in the parking lot, but no sign of the doctor himself. The security guard at the front desk informed her that Dr. Chen had arrived an hour earlier, but had left again after receiving what appeared to be an urgent phone call. Martinez's blood ran cold. She tried calling Dr. Chen's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. A text message arrived moments later from his number. Something urgent came up. Meet me at the warehouse address from the recording. Come alone. Every instinct Martinez had developed over 8 years as a detective screamed that this was a trap. But she also knew that Dr. Chen might genuinely be in trouble, and abandoning him could mean losing the only other person who fully understood the scope of the conspiracy they'd uncovered. The warehouse was located in an industrial district that had seen better days. Most of the buildings were abandoned or barely functional, creating a maze of empty parking lots and broken windows. Martinez approached cautiously, her service weapon drawn and her radio set to an emergency frequency. The building looked exactly as Detective Chen had described it in his recording, a nondescript structure with loading docks and minimal windows. Martinez's car was the only vehicle in the parking lot, but she could see tire tracks in the gravel that suggested recent activity. The main door was unlocked, which set off every alarm bell in Martinez's mind. She called out Dr. Chen's name, but received no response. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit by a few hanging fluorescent fixtures, casting harsh shadows across stacks of wooden crates and industrial equipment. It was then that she smelled it, the same mixture of copper and decay that had filled her nostrils in Hartwell's basement. Following the scent deeper into the warehouse, Martinez discovered that the building's true purpose became apparent in its rear section. What she found there defied her worst nightmares. The warehouse had been converted into a processing facility that combined the efficiency of a slaughterhouse with the sterility of an operating room. Stainless steel tables were arranged in neat rows, each equipped with surgical instruments and drainage systems. Industrial refrigeration units lined the walls, their contents hidden behind locked doors that Martinez didn't want to open. But most horrifying of all was the evidence of recent activity. One of the tables still had restraints attached, darkly stained from use. Surgical instruments lay scattered nearby, as if abandoned in haste, and hanging from hooks along one wall were police uniforms from various departments, ready to be worn by the cultists during their ritualistic activities. Martinez was documenting the scene with her camera when she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around to find herself facing a group of police officers, but not the ones she'd expected. Instead of the corrupt cult members she'd been investigating, she recognized several officers from her own department, including her lieutenant and 2 detectives she'd worked with for years. "Martinez," Lieutenant Thompson said, his voice heavy with resignation, "we've been looking for you." "Are you here to arrest me or kill me?" Martinez asked, her weapon still drawn but pointed at the floor. Thompson's expression was pained. "Neither. We're here to get you out of this mess before it's too late." What followed was a revelation that shattered Martinez's remaining faith in the system she'd served. Her colleagues explained that they'd been conducting their own investigation into the corruption within the department, working with a joint task force that included FBI and DEA agents. The cannibalistic cult was real, but it was just one part of a larger criminal enterprise that involved drug trafficking, human trafficking, and political corruption at the highest levels. "We know about Hartwell," Detective Rodriguez explained. "We know about Morrison and his group. But if you release that evidence now, you'll destroy years of undercover work and let the biggest players escape justice." Martinez felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "What about Dr. Chen? Where is he?" "Safe," Thompson assured her. "We extracted him this morning when we learned Morrison's people were planning to grab him. He's in protective custody, and his evidence is secure." The officers explained that the warehouse had been under surveillance for months as part of their investigation. They'd allowed Martinez to enter knowing she was in no immediate danger, hoping to convince her to join their official operation rather than continue her dangerous freelance investigation. But as they spoke, Martinez noticed something that made her stomach drop. Lieutenant Thompson was wearing a ring she'd seen before, in one of the photographs from Hartwell's basement. A distinctive signet ring with symbols that appeared to be related to the cult's ritualistic practices. "You're one of them," she whispered, raising her weapon. Thompson's expression didn't change, but the other officers began moving to surround her. "Detective Martinez, you're making a serious mistake. Put your weapon down and let us explain." "Explain what?" "How you've been part of this network all along. How you've been feeding information to Morrison." Martinez backed toward a wall, trying to keep all of them in view. "You don't understand," Rodriguez said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "Yes, some of us have infiltrated the cult. It was the only way to get close enough to gather evidence. Thompson has been undercover for 3 years, risking his life to document their activities." Martinez wanted to believe them, but too many things didn't add up. If they were truly the good guys, why hadn't they rescued the victims she'd seen referenced in Hartwell's logs? Why had the evidence from Hartwell's basement been allowed to disappear? And most importantly, why was Dr. Chen's rescue timed so conveniently to prevent their planned disclosure? "Where's the real evidence?" she demanded. "Show me proof that you're actually trying to stop these people instead of just controlling the investigation." Thompson reached slowly into his jacket and Martinez tensed, but instead of a weapon he produced a thick folder. "Everything's in here. Names, dates, locations. We've been building a case that will take down the entire network, but we need more time." Martinez accepted the folder but kept her weapon raised. As she flipped through the pages, she saw what appeared to be comprehensive documentation of the cult's activities. Surveillance photos, financial records, intercepted communications. It all seemed legitimate. But then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The dates on several surveillance photos were wrong. Photos that purported to show cult gatherings from months earlier actually showed events that had taken place after Martinez began her investigation. The timestamps revealed that these weren't evidence of long-term surveillance. They were documentation of ongoing participation. "These photos were taken last week," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thompson's friendly mask finally slipped. "Detective Martinez, you've been very thorough. Perhaps too thorough for your own good." The warehouse erupted into chaos. Martinez dove behind one of the stainless steel tables as gunfire exploded around her. The officers who had claimed to be rescuing her were now trying to kill her, their weapons drawn and their intent murderous. Fragments of concrete and metal flew as bullets ricocheted off the industrial equipment. Martinez realized that the table she was hiding behind was one of the processing stations where victims had been dismembered, and the irony of seeking shelter there while fighting for her own life wasn't lost on her. She returned fire, aiming for the overhead lights to create darkness that might give her an advantage. One by one, the fluorescent fixtures exploded, plunging sections of the warehouse into shadows that danced with muzzle flashes. "There's nowhere to run, Martinez," Thompson called out. "Make this easy on yourself." But Martinez had no intention of making anything easy. She'd spent too many sleepless nights thinking about the victims whose disappearances had been covered up by corrupt officers. She'd seen too much evidence of systematic abuse hidden behind badges and uniforms. If she was going to die, she was going to take as many of these monsters with her as possible. Using the industrial equipment as cover, Martinez worked her way toward the rear of the warehouse, hoping to find another exit. Behind her, she could hear the officers coordinating their search, their voices professional and calm despite the fact that they were hunting down one of their own colleagues. It was then that Martinez heard something that made her freeze in her tracks, the sound of additional vehicles arriving outside the warehouse. Car doors slamming, voices calling out tactical positions, the unmistakable sounds of a SWAT team deployment. "This is FBI. The building is surrounded." The gunfire stopped abruptly. Martinez held her breath, uncertain whether the new arrivals represented salvation or just another layer of corruption. In her experience over the past few months, no authority figure could be trusted completely. What followed was a tense standoff that seemed to last forever, but probably only took minutes. The corrupt officers attempted to surrender, claiming they were legitimate law enforcement engaged in an authorized operation. But the FBI team wasn't buying their story, particularly when they discovered Martinez hiding behind the processing equipment with evidence of obvious violence around her. The federal agents who eventually rescued Martinez were part of a task force that had been investigating police corruption across multiple jurisdictions for over 2 years. They'd been tracking the same network that Martinez had stumbled upon, but from a different angle focused on financial crimes and organized conspiracy. Special Agent Lisa Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, explained that Martinez's amateur investigation had actually helped break open their case by providing evidence they'd been unable to obtain through traditional means. Your discovery of Hartwell's logs gave us the documentation we needed to prove the existence of the cult, Agent Chen explained as they sat in a secure FBI facility. But more importantly, it helped us identify the communication networks and financial structures that kept this organization operating. Dr. Chen was indeed safe, having been taken into protective custody when federal agents learned of the threats against both their lives. The evidence they'd gathered was now part of a massive federal investigation that was expected to result in indictments across multiple states. But Martinez's ordeal was far from over. The corruption within her own department ran deeper than anyone had initially realized, and her own colleagues couldn't be trusted to protect her from retaliation. She was placed in the Witness Protection Program while the federal investigation continued. Her identity changed, and her location kept secret from local law enforcement. The trials that followed would make national headlines. Over 40 police officers from 7 different states were indicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to racketeering. The evidence revealed a network that had operated for over 30 years, protected by corruption at every level of the justice system. Captain William Morrison was found dead in his cell before he could testify, apparently having hanged himself with bedsheets. The suicide note he left behind contained detailed confessions about the cult's activities, but also named dozens of additional conspirators who had not yet been identified by federal investigators. Lieutenant Thompson and Detective Rodriguez were both convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During their trials, evidence emerged that they had participated in the murders of at least 12 victims over a 3-year period, including 2 fellow officers who had threatened to expose the conspiracy. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the revelation that the network had been specifically recruiting police officers' children, grooming them from an early age to join the organization when they became adults. Several defendants were found to be second- or third-generation members of families that had been involved in the cult for decades. Martinez, testifying under her new identity, provided crucial evidence that helped convict most of the conspirators. But she also learned that the network had been larger than even she had imagined, with tentacles reaching into federal agencies, prosecutors' offices, and even some of the judges' chambers where the trials took place. The experience changed Martinez in ways that would never fully heal. She could no longer trust anyone in uniform, including herself. The badge that had once represented honor and service had become a symbol of potential corruption and abuse. She resigned from law enforcement entirely, choosing to work as a private investigator specializing in cases involving police misconduct. Years later, Martinez would still wake up in cold sweats, reliving the moment she first descended into Hartwell's basement and discovered the true scope of evil that could hide behind a police uniform. She knew that the network they'd exposed was just one example of corruption within law enforcement, and that similar conspiracies were likely operating in other jurisdictions across the country. The official investigation concluded that at least 63 people had been murdered by members of the cult over the course of 3 decades. But Martinez suspected the actual number was much higher, with many victims' disappearances never properly investigated due to the corrupt officers who controlled the missing persons cases. The families of the confirmed victims received settlements from the various police departments involved, but no amount of money could compensate for the betrayal of trust that had allowed their loved ones to be hunted by the very people who should have protected them. Dr. Chen continued his work as a forensic pathologist, but focused his expertise on cases involving police misconduct. He established a foundation dedicated to investigating suspicious deaths in police custody and providing support for families seeking justice against corrupt law enforcement agencies. The warehouse where Martinez had nearly lost her life was demolished, but not before federal agents recovered additional evidence that led to several more arrests. Hidden beneath the building's foundation, investigators found the remains of at least 20 additional victims, their bodies showing signs of the systematic torture and organ removal that had become the cult's signature. Martinez's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked police power and the importance of civilian oversight in law enforcement agencies. But it also served as a reminder that even within the most corrupt systems, individual officers with courage and conscience could still make a difference. The network they'd exposed had operated successfully for decades because it exploited the trust that citizens place in police officers. By wearing the uniform and carrying the badge, the cult members had been able to access vulnerable victims and cover up their crimes with an authority that few people questioned. But Martinez's investigation had also revealed that not all police officers were part of the conspiracy. Many were honest professionals who had been kept in the dark about their colleagues' activities, and some had even been targeted for elimination when they began asking uncomfortable questions. The federal task force that ultimately brought down the network included dozens of law enforcement officers who had risked their careers and their lives to expose the corruption within their own departments. Their example proved that the badge could still represent honor and justice, but only when worn by people willing to hold themselves and their colleagues accountable. Martinez's new life in the witness protection program was quiet and anonymous, but she found purpose in her work helping other victims of police misconduct seek justice. She knew that the network they'd exposed was just the tip of the iceberg, and that similar conspiracies were likely operating in jurisdictions across the country. But she also knew that her story had helped expose the truth about police corruption and had given other whistleblowers the courage to come forward with their own evidence of misconduct. Change was possible, but only if people were willing to fight for it, regardless of the personal cost. The horror of what she'd discovered in Hartwell's basement would never fully leave Martinez's memory, but she'd transformed that trauma into a mission to protect others from similar victimization. In the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson from her experience, that even in the face of systematic corruption and institutional betrayal, individual conscience and courage could still prevail. The badge might be tarnished by those who wore it dishonorably, but it could still shine when carried by those committed to real justice and protection of the innocent. Martinez had learned that the hard way, but she'd emerged with her own integrity intact and a determination to ensure that the victims of police corruption would never be forgotten. Their stories would live on, serving as a reminder that power without accountability inevitably leads to abuse, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would exploit the trust society places in its guardians. Have you ever wondered what other dark secrets might be hiding behind the thin blue line? What stories remain buried in evidence lockers and sealed files across the country? If these real accounts of police corruption and abuse have opened your eyes to the dangers of unchecked authority, subscribe to our channel for more investigations into the hidden truths that shape our criminal justice system. Share your own experiences or theories in the comments below. Sometimes the most important stories come from those who've witnessed them firsthand.